Steve Neff from Neff Strategies Consulting Group with you here today on another episode of Policing Pontifications. Today we're going to talk about how suspect interviews by police officers can be a lot like Indiana Jones style archaeological digs. What could those two things possibly have in common? Well, I want to focus today on elements of the offense, admissions by the suspect, and attribution of information or equipment or items to the suspect that ultimately will help prosecutors prove their case. Confessions are generally considered to be the holy grail, Indiana Jones style, of suspect interviews. Maybe that's true, although hopefully I somewhat disabused you of that notion in my last episode of Policing Pontifications, where we talked about false exculpatory statements. But even if confessions are the holy grail of such interviews, we can't forget the other valuable artifacts that can come from digging a little bit during the suspect interviews, even if you never make it to that holy grail moment. Prosecutors have to prove cases beyond a reasonable doubt, and of course everybody knows that. And police officers understand that prosecutors have to prove each charge that gets charged beyond a reasonable doubt. But it's a little bit more difficult and complex than that, because it's not just about, in a general sense, proving the charge. Each criminal statute contains specific elements that the prosecution must prove in order for the defendant to be found guilty. So if a particular statute has 4 elements that the government has to prove, and I'm able to prove 3 of those 4 elements to 100-degree certainty, but I'm only able to prove the 4th element to perhaps a 75% certainty, then I lose. I don't get the conviction, I lose the case, and a guilty person walks away free. So why is this important to police interviews? Well, because police officers who understand and know the elements of each potential charge that they are investigating during the course of their interviewing, that can help them procure valuable admissions and attributions from the suspect that make the case that much better and help the prosecution prove the case, even if they never secure that holy grail confession. So let's look at several examples, and I have several little scripts written down here, so be patient with me while we go through that. First example, for a federal charge of felon in possession of a firearm, the government has to prove 4 elements. The first element is that the defendant actually possessed the gun or the ammunition. The second element is that the gun had to, at some point in its life, crossed state lines, have been involved in interstate commerce. Often we prove that by showing that it was manufactured in a different state in which it was found. Third, we have to prove that at the time of the possession of the gun, the defendant had been convicted of a felony offense. And fourth, we have to prove that the defendant knew that he had been convicted of a felony offense. So, more times than I can count in my career, I had police officers interview suspects who had no problem admitting to the possession of the firearm, but were very reticent and reluctant to admit to ownership of the firearm, and that just comes from a misunderstanding of what the elements of the offense are. We don't have to prove that the person possessing it was also the owner of it. So when a suspect does say something along the lines that suggests that he was in possession of the gun, then that's a big oops on behalf of the defendant. So smart officers, when a suspect says, "That's not my gun," do not stop there. So here's an example of a true statement that's designed by the defendant to be exculpatory, but is actually inculpatory. The officer asks the defendant, "How did the gun get in your car?" And the suspect says, "Well, my buddy Joey asked me to hold on to it for him." Bang. We have just unearthed a very valuable artifact. So we've gotten a lot further along the road to proving the felon in possession case than we were when we first started. Second example, for a federal charge of obstructing a federal investigation by tampering with or destroying evidence, the government must prove 2 elements. The first one, that the defendant knowingly destroyed or altered an item, and second, that the defendant acted with the intent to obstruct an actual or contemplated federal investigation. So In this scenario, let's say that the law enforcement agent had a search warrant for the suspect's phone, and it's related to a terrorist attack by the suspect's friend. But when the officer shows up to execute the warrant, he discovers that the suspect had recently deleted numerous images and videos, as well as possible communications and texts that had taken place between him and the terrorist who completed the attack. The suspect denies deleting those things with the intent to obstruct the investigation. It's designed to be an exculpatory statement, in this case a false exculpatory statement. So let's see how that can play out, even if we never get him to admit that he did it on purpose. Police officer, how did all this information get deleted from your phone? Suspect, I deleted it. Officer, what did you think would happen after your friend committed the attack? Suspect, well, I knew there would be an investigation. Police officer, did you believe that eventually the police would contact you as part of the investigation? Suspect, yes. And police, well, when did you delete these contents? Suspect, the day after the attack. Police, why? Defendant, I was afraid that that stuff might implicate me. Boom. These admissions, although short of an outright confession, just moved the ball down the field and unearthed some more valuable artifacts that can be used in the prosecution. So here's the third example. Let's say we have a federal charge of distributing child sexual abuse material, CSAM, and if we do, the government has three elements it must prove. First, that the defendant knowingly distributed an item of CSAM. Second, that the item of CSAM had been transported in interstate or foreign commerce, including by computer. And third, when the defendant distributed the item, he knew that it was CSAM. Now, the challenge in these cases is always about and center on attribution. Even if we can prove that the defendant's computer was the vehicle that caused the distribution, that is insufficient proof that the defendant himself is the one who sent it. So we need some attribution here. Why is this important to a police interview? Well, understanding how important it is to be able to get this attribution, the police officer can ask questions that will help us meet that element by getting the defendant to admit to some sort of attribution. So it starts off with the typical false exculpatory statement. The suspect says, man, I don't know that stuff. I didn't know it was on there. I certainly didn't distribute it. Police officer, tell me who lives here. Suspect, just me. I have a girlfriend who sometimes stays here. Police officer, how often? Suspect, she stays for maybe about one weekend a month. Police officer, where does she live? Suspect, she lives about 2 hours away in Nashville. Police, what does she do for a living? Suspect, she's a flight attendant. Police, really? From where does she usually fly? Suspect, she works for Southwest Airlines out of Nashville. Police, is your computer password protected? Suspect, yes. Did you ever give her or anyone else your password or access to your computer? Suspect, no. Pow. We learned some very valuable information even though the defendant didn't confess. And we can lock it down further by following up on the information about his girlfriend, who, by the time we go to trial, I guarantee you, is going to be the one the defendant is blaming for the distribution of the CSAM. So when we examine the computer, we can learn exactly when certain images were received and distributed. We can then take those times and check and see if the girlfriend was working or even in town on those dates. And when we can show that she wasn't in town or she was working, the evidence against the defendant becomes much stronger, and we can show that the computer and the activity on the computer can be attributed to him and only him, which helps prove our case. So just in these three examples, we've unearthed some pretty valuable artifacts that are going to be valuable not just in a museum, but in the courtroom for the prosecutor, even though the defendant never once in any of these instances would have given us what we would call a packaged confession. So keep digging, Try to find those valuable jewels that are hidden underneath the defendant's false exculpatory statements, and you make the case even stronger. If you have any comments, please leave them below. And in the meantime, let's talk about it.